Okay, so welcome back from a break, everybody. This week, we're going to continue our exploration of the principles of animation by adding in a new layer, okay? Last week, we focused our attention on two major principles of animation. Does anyone remember what those two are?
Gravity.
Yeah, that was one of the ideas that we were looking to suggest in our work. But what specifically were the principles that we were looking to infuse in our artwork? Those are mechanical things, principles of movement. Oh, I should have given a pop quiz today.
You might as well give one.
Arcs, right? Arcs, that was one of the principles that we talked about last week. And what was the other one? Timing, okay? Now, talk to me about arcs for a second. Yep, nothing moves in a straight line, right? Nothing in our universe moves linearly in a straight line. Sometimes we may perceive it to be moving in a straight line, but we're not actually moving in a straight line. A great example of that is when we walk down the street. On the surface, it may look like we're walking in a straight line, but are we actually walking in a straight line? We're actually going up and down. We're bobbing as we walk. Okay, so the perception may be that we're moving in a straight line, but every single motion in our universe happens along an arc. Okay? Now, earlier, there were some people were saying it. Arcs allow us to suggest a couple different things. What is one of those things? Gravity. Absolutely. It's the one physical force that we cannot turn off here in good old Mother Earth. Okay? Everything is influenced by gravity. Arcs allow us to very quickly begin to simulate and suggest the influence of gravity on all of our movements. So it plays a really important role in helping our animations start to feel more believable. Remember, this is a trick. This is an illusion. But we have tools in our toolbox that will help this trick be a little bit more real. Okay? Arcs, and then, of course, timing is another one. Now, timing also dovetails into the illusion of gravity. Last week when you were animating your pendulum, hopefully you infused the principle of timing into your movements by doing what? Which does what? Bingo. It starts to change the speed of our movement, right? The tops of every single swing, gravity has having the most influence on our pendulum, and it's slowing down the movement in that area. So if I was to draw this on the board real fast, okay. So here's our pendulum. You know, here, this is the conclusion of our arc. How did we draw the pendulum going into the beginnings and the ends of its movement path? What did we do? How do we do it? And specifically, how did you do that? Yeah, you got it. So if this is animation frame 1, animation frame 2 looks like this, right? And then 3, maybe a little bit more spaced out. 4 is like right here, and then 5, maybe you don't even need 5. Maybe 5 is here in the center, okay? And you can start to see that the distance that the ball is traveling in between the frame is pretty small up here at the top, which creates the illusion of a slower speed, right? Timing is all about speed, understanding how fast and how slow things are moving inside of our movement, okay? Good animators spend 20 years trying to figure this out. It's probably one of the more difficult things for us to master as animators, because everyone on the face of the planet is going to have a unique understanding of speed, right? You know, look at how we drive on the highways. Some people are going a zillion miles an hour. Other people are Captain Slow like me, going 5 miles, safely 5 miles underneath the speed limit, right? We all have a different understanding of speed based on how we perceive things. This is a tough principle to really get good at, which is why we start studying its effects at the beginning, because you're going to need the next 15 years to be really, really good at it, okay? If you watch and start to break down some really good animation, maybe this will be your homework this week, okay, in addition to the things that we're going to draw. Go watch a cartoon or watch something that's animated. You're going to see that the animation transitions between really fast parts to really slow parts to really fast parts, okay? Those moments, those different speed changes creates contrast, okay? And our subconscious and our brain picks up on those speed changes very, very directly. So timing and arcs, that's what we went over last week. Everything moves along a curved path, and nothing is moving at a consistent linear rate. There are constant speed changes throughout every movement, which in turn helps simulate gravity and reminds our audience that this thing is alive, okay? Now this week, we're also going to start talking and exploring our next principle of animation. It's probably one of the go-to. It's the one that most of you probably have maybe heard before if you've taken an animation class or you've been exposed to the world of animation. And that's the principle of squash and stretch. Have you guys heard of squash and stretch before? Yeah, squash and stretch is out there all over the place, okay? Now, for those of you that have maybe a little bit of exposure to the world of animation, what does squash and stretch do? Yeah, I like it. It shows like the little hardness of the material.
And how heavy it is.
Okay, I like it, absolutely. So if I was to drop a ball, okay, yeah, kind of a little bit, it starts to highlight very quickly the rigidity of that object, right? How soft or hard it is, right? Now, if I was to drop this ball onto the concrete here, of course the path would go down here. Without any sort of squash and stretch, that would be what the frame would look like in its contact pose as it strikes the ground. Without any sort of deformation of the primary character, what are we communicating to the audience here? That this is like a 2 million pound ball, right? But we're not working with super heavy objects like this. We're working with soft body objects. All of our characters are these flappy bags of, organs and what have you that we need to bring to life. Squash and stretch reminds our audience that there is something on the inside of our character that's influencing and deforming its shape, okay? In essence, squash and stretch allows us to very quickly show our audience that this thing is a living, breathing character. It's not just an inanimate sphere anymore. Now it's a rubber ball that maybe is moving under its own control, that maybe there's a small suggestion of a spine or some sort of skeletal system that's controlling how this character is jumping around the scene. We get to do that with squash and stretch, right? Now, we see squash and stretch all over the place. In our day-to-day lives, we see squash and stretch in every single moment. Now, I'm wearing, we bend our arms here, and our muscles are going to squash and stretch around our bones, right? The deformation of our human form is dependent on squash and stretch, right? So we should start suggesting that in our animations. Now, the cool thing about squash and stretch is there are no rules when it comes to squash and stretch. We can do whatever the hell we want, which is pretty fun, right? We're just trying to suggest something. In this suggestion, there is plenty of room for invention, okay? Which is the cool and the fun part about being an animator. We can break all the rules if we wanted to, right? So when it comes to squash and stretch, there really is no determining factor as to what that contact pose down here at the bottom needs to look like, right? Shoot, we can have a whole lot of fun with this. And every moment of invention is going to take us down a new path and a new suggestion as what's on the inside. Maybe the squash and stretch pose looks something like that, right? Where the top part of the sphere is, kind of keeps its shape, and the bottom part gets heavily deformed as it strikes the ground. That's a cool invention, right? Kind of looks like an ice cream cone top, okay? Or maybe we can not do it as intensely. Maybe the squash and stretch pose looks like that, okay? Both of those, in comparison to each other, starts to suggest a different type of rigidity. One that's maybe a little bit more elastic versus one that's a little bit more rigid. We should always look to infuse a little bit of squash and stretch. Everything bends in our world, okay? Just at different rates. A rubber ball that you'd throw someone in a dodgeball game is going to bend at a different rate than that of a bowling ball, but a bowling ball is still going to bend, okay? Just because we perceive it to not be bending doesn't mean it's actually not bending, right? Case in point, have you ever seen those like super slow-mo videos, right? The ones that are shot like 10,000 frames a second. I always love watching the ones of like car tires, okay? I saw one of a race car the other day. It was like a 10,000 frames per second slow-mo video of a race car tire, you know, spinning up and then taking off, right? And once you see the tire, you know, in real time, we perceive the tire to be a solid, rigid object, right? But once we break the illusion of time and slowing things down, it was amazing to see these ripples, and the entire tire was deforming and bending into this wobbly shape as it started to spin against the concrete. And then all of a sudden it got grip, and it kind of locked into shape, and boom, it was off to the races, right? I have to apologize. My allergies are going crazy right now, so if I sound stuffy, I apologize. So squash and stretch is a critical component in helping our characters physically breathe and come to life. We're deforming our characters and stretching them out. Now the squash and stretch, you know, in my mind, squash and stretch is kind of like creating the illusion of a spring, okay? Whenever a spring compresses, what's its next, you know, what's the next thing it's going to want to do? Boom, expand back out, which is why it's squash and stretch, okay? We're allowed to stretch out our objects in a lot of really creative ways to, again, to highlight the organic nature of the objects that we're creating, okay? So maybe as my ball is bouncing up, you know, maybe it's doing this, okay? That's its motion path. Okay, eventually it's going to have to return to its original shape, right? But that's not how we initially, well, that's a humongous sphere here. These two are relatively the same size. This is like 3 times the size, so we can pretend, okay? It's an art class, we can pretend, right? But maybe this next keyframe gets a little stretched out, okay? As if it's choosing to kind of launch its top, and then the back part of its form follows, okay? This is the cool thing about squash and stretch, is that we can experiment and try and change the shape of our objects to suggest something else, right? It's the power of character animation, is that we're trying to create the illusion of life, but there are many ways to get to that illusion. Squash and stretch and the principles of animation are guidelines, right? They're kind of like the pirate laws, right? They're guidelines. We can, you know, get us going in the right direction, but we can deviate here and there. Character animators need to come to this whole process with a healthy sense of invention. We want to try things and see how it affects the overall animation. Squash and stretch is going to be a critical component to this week's both lab and homework assignment. And we're going to be continuing to infuse squash and stretch almost on every single project going forward. I've intentionally started with arcs, timing, and squash and stretch because they really are 3 of the 4 most important principles of animation that we should get good at. The 4th one is going to be anticipation. Okay, we'll talk about that next week. So let's go over to animate real fast and start looking specifically at how we can begin to suggest and include squash and stretch on some very simple animation frames. Mr. Driver, would you mind hitting the lights, please? Thank you. All right. Let's do it. Of course, naturally, here in Animate, we're going to want to start off with a brand new canvas. So I'm going to go into the File, New section, and our media playback templates are going to yield us the template that we're after, which is, of course, this title-safe HDTV 720. Let's just go ahead and create the canvas, or the stage, excuse me. And this is what we get. Now, from last week's conversation about working inside of Canvas, about working inside of Animate, I apologize, we learned that this is a layered-based animation program. Now, for your homework in lab last week, I asked you to start to create some background elements. So here's a good practice if you're as we continue to work with background elements. I'm going to get rid of this title and action safe layer for the moment. And then I'm going to create a new layer by clicking on the little page icon in the bottom right left-hand corner of my application. And I'm going to call this ball. And of course, this one is going to be background. I'm simply just double-clicking on the name to change its name. And I'm going to start to create some simple illustrations. Now, for my animation, I think what I'm going to do is that I'm simply going to use the shape creation tools to start fleshing out, just a really, really simple animation that highlights the power of squash and stretch, and some ideas that will help us create some really cool animations. So I'm going to start off with just a very, very small box. There we go. So that's going to be my ground. I want to keep zoomed in just for illustration purposes. That way we can see the timeline pretty easy on the screen. So that's going to be my ground. Big suggestion. This is a big helper. When you're animating, create a ground. Okay? That's going to help you visualize where all these objects are going to deform around. Don't animate without any sort of illusion of where the background is, right? Where the ground plane really is. Trust me, it makes it go a whole lot faster and a whole lot easier. Okay? And of course, naturally, now that I've drawn some content on frame 1 here on my background layer, you can easily see in my timeline that I've begun to populate my timeline with some animation keyframes. Okay? I got a light gray rectangle with a black dot on it. As we know from last week's conversation, that means independent drawing, a keyframe. All right, let's jump over, and I'm going to create a simple sphere. And let's make it a nice shade of, I don't know, a nice shade of blue. I'm going to turn the outlines off for this one. Some people kind of got caught up into, a little thing over the course of the last week where when we drew your circle, you noticed that the outline for your circle was now separate from the actual filled part of your circle. We had two different things happening inside the frame. I almost always, out of habit, turn my stroke, my outline of my shapes off. You can do that by clicking on this color swatch, and you can find the option in the upper right-hand corner, this little white cube with the red line going down through it. In addition, we also learned about the perils of drawing inside of object mode. So I'm going to ensure that object mode is on as I create the things that I truly want to animate to ensure that I get the most editability over all of these shapes throughout the entirety of my time here in Animate. Let's go back down into the area of the stage that I'm going to animate and start flushing out what's eventually going to be my simple little animation. So I think I want to have my ball start right in here somewhere. Okay? Oops, I'm going to hit undo. I made a mistake. I forgot to click on the animation layer that I want to use to house my animation. My bad. I apologize. There we go. Try that again. There's my sphere. Voila! Wonderful. That's my ball. Okay. Now for your lab assignment this week, you're going to be doing just a single bounce, a single jump. Okay. So I want to show you maybe some ideas on how we can start to throw down some squash and stretch for our little ball. Now there's a couple different ways that we can do this. Okay. Let's return to our practice. I think it's really important that we be good practitioners and we be disciplined in our animation pipeline here. The first part of animating is what? Drawing what? Yeah, key frames. We got to create all of our key frames first, our key drawings, the drawings that are representative of the total movement. We can't forget that, okay? That's the first stage. Now, I think I'm just going to create a couple, just a few key frames here, and then, to illustrate this example, and then we'll move on, all right? So here on frame number 1, that's my first key frame. How do I create another key frame? F6, you got it. So I want to make sure that key frame is selected, and I'll hit F6. So if you look carefully at your timeline, these are independent keyframes. However, it did create a hold keyframe on my background, which is exactly what I want, because I want to see that small gray ground bar on both of my drawings above it. Okay. All right. So now with that keyframe created, I'm free to go in and start manipulating this sphere. Now, I know that probably for my second keyframe, I should suggest, oh, I don't know, where it impacts on the ground, something like that. There it is. There's my second keyframe. Now, I'm intentionally not going to put any squash and stretch on this, so we can get a good understanding of what it looks like without squash and stretch first. And then we'll go back and add a little bit and make it feel and look a little bit more realistic. All right, one more keyframe. I'll hit F6. And then with it created, I'll simply move it up a little bit. All right, so with that created, let's go in and start timing this out, because that's the second phase of this animation, of our animation sequence, right? We create the keyframes, and then we time them out, okay? Now, in your mind, what are you doing when you time out your keyframes? What are we doing? Last week when you were working on your homework in your lab, you should have done this, okay? What are we doing when we time out our keyframes? Yeah, we're going to fill in all the in-betweens after, right? But the purpose of timing out all of our keyframes is to explore how long our animation is going to be. Because clearly, it's not going to be an eighth of a second, okay? It's going to be quite longer than that. Well, how long is it going to be? This is why we're here, to explore the total timing of all these keyframes. Which keyboard shortcut allows us to explore our understanding of time, or the understanding of the duration of our animation in Animate? F5, you got it. So now I got to start kind of projecting a little bit. How long do I want this ball to fall? What's the distance, the time between this drawing and the next drawing where it strikes the ground? Boof. Boof. Well, I don't know. Boof. What is that? 10 frames. Let's do 10 frames. I'm guessing here. You're going to find with your experience, you'll get your own kind of understanding of timing. I'm a musician, so I can start to put a beat in my head pretty quickly, and I can just like, boof, boof, boof. You know, I can figure it out. I do everything with that boof sound in my mind. It kind of works for me. You'll figure out what works for you, right? So I'm going to take about that long before it hits the ground, okay? Now, when I hit F5 on that first drawing on my ball layer, notice that it didn't extend out the bottom layer, my background layer. So what do I need to do to make sure that this gray bar is way over here? F5, yeah. I'm a big fan of F5. Just bloop, there it goes. Now, upon every edit, and this is a good practice to get into, upon every edit, play your animation, right? Remember, this is a movement-based art form. You have to watch it. You have to consume what you've created and make some decisions based on your analysis. So I have the enter key. Okay, I'm liking so far, but it's hard to see really the totality of the effect without any sort of in-between frames between my second drawing and my third. So how long? Let's see, it took 10 frames to fall. The next bounce is going to be a little bit shorter. It's not going all the way up to the exact same height. So maybe there's, I don't know, let's just guess. Maybe there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 frames. Let's see how we do now. And I'll extend out my background layer once again. Yeah. That's good. I'm liking that. Oof. Cool. At this point, if I decide that it's too slow, I can strip some of those in-between frames out, right? Maybe it's too long. The drop is too long in here. And I can say, well, maybe let's just remove one of these frames. Sometimes literally one frame will change the speed, okay? I want to remove one of these frames too, just so I can get rid of that optical illusion. Let's do this. Yeah, I like it. Let's do it. I'm going to remove one more frame in here. And I think I'm also going to remove 2 frames on that second bounce. Okay? Yeah, that feels a little bit more right, doesn't it? It feels like it's going thunk and bouncing up, okay? This is the cool part about working inside of Animate, is that we get to iterate on our timing pretty quickly. I've only still made 3 drawings. I'm only still messing with 3 drawings. Now I'm just figuring out how long we're transitioning between those 3 drawings with these hold keyframes, okay? This timing part of our animation is the most important part, right? Because in every sense, we're setting up the next stage. Drawing the keyframes, that's wicked easy. With some experience, you guys are going to be rocking and rolling drawing keyframes pretty quickly. It's the timing part that's going to take us the longest to get there. So I figured out my timing. I experimented. I thought one way, but then I decided that I really didn't like what I had prototyped, so I removed some frames. I made it go a little bit faster, and I'm pretty jazzed with what I've created. I'm ready to start creating all of my in-between drawings now. And specifically, I know exactly how many in-betweens I need to draw, right? You only want to draw your in-betweens one time, okay? Because this is where all the labor in animation comes from. We physically have to create 16 individual drawings now, okay? And if this is a character, which you're going to be doing here, next week or the week after, I can't remember now off the top of my head, this could take some time. So we want to make sure that we're preserving our sanity and our own time by only doing the number that we need. All right. Yeah.
When you select an object and then move it without deselecting it, you press F6, it fills up all the selected frames, right?
So
And
when
automatically selects all of them.
let's speak with great certainty on what you're talking about. So you select an object. Yeah. And then down here in the timeline, see it's saying all of these frames here are this drawing. Yep. So whatever is selected down here will be influenced by our keyboard shortcuts. So F6, see how they all go to independent keyframes? You're more than welcome to do that, absolutely. Here's what I do. I go to the next one, okay? And then I hit F6. Because now frames 2 through, 8 are now that drawing, okay? And it makes it a little bit more organic, because now I can move it down a little bit, okay? And then I'll go forward the next frame, hit F6. I'll move it down a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
I ran into an issue where I couldn't delete one object in multiple frames. Like, it was in like the whole thing.
Yeah. Now,
You have to go frame by frame and delete it.
you don't necessarily have to, but it is important to point out there's a multi-frame. Get out of here, Doc. There's a multi-frame. I think it's this one. Okay. With this toggle enabled. Okay. Now I can edit multiple frames at one time, and the range of frames that I can adjust are influenced by the slider. So if I wanted to globally move all of these shapes this way, I'm able to do that because of the multi-frame option enabled. Yeah. All right, let me turn that off. Hit F6 on that last one. Bring it down. Let's see how we're doing here. There it is. So we're starting to get there. Woo! All right. So without squash and stretching here, it looks pretty boring, doesn't it? There's not a whole lot of life. It just looks like a darn ball hitting the ground, but we don't get any sort of indication that the ground is influencing our character, the ball, right? So let's go back. I'm going to go to my middle keyframe, this guy, and I want to start to adjust the shape of my character here to give it a little bit of squash and stretch, which will in turn give it a tremendous amount of life and character, okay? Now, one of the things that I'm happy with inside of Animate is the sub-selection tool, the white arrow. The V key, V as in Victor, is the direct selection tool. It will allow me to select the entire circle. But the A key, A as in Alpha, will allow me to select the control points that create this shape, right? Now, if you're using vector shapes, it's pretty fun. You just grab these little control handles here. Start giving it a little bit of squash and stretch. Now, I'm all zoomed in. Whoops. Let's make something real fun here. Now my ball is super small, so the control points are kind of hard to manage. Yeah, it's a little squash and stretch. Bloop. Little squash and stretch. I'd probably want to have another frame like that one. One more frame in here where it's really squashed out. Hold on a second. I want to see if I can zoom in. I'm going to use the Z key. There it is. Now I can see what's going on. Let's have some fun with this. Whoops. I'm just moving these control points around, just changing its form. And then, of course, naturally, I'll go back in and play it. Let's see. Let's move this one down a little bit. Yeah. And then it needs to go back up, right? So it squashes, and then it's going to need to go back up. This is where we start stretching it out and going into the next key frame, okay? But this is the type of animation that we want to craft for both our lab and our homework this week. Squash and stretch gives us the ability to start, in suggesting very directly this organic nature to all of our objects, that our environment is in fact influencing our foreground, which is pretty fun and very cool. Now, if we return to Canvas just for 1 second here, I want to make sure that you guys understand that there's two different things that we're creating this week. The first, our homework. It's going to be due next week. It's going to be the bouncing ball. It's going to be at least 40 frames, okay? Your ball has to just bounce on at least 3 times. It doesn't even have to be a ball. Something has to bounce 3 times. And you have to show me your mastery of arcs, timing, squash, and stretch, okay? Arcs and timing we looked at last week. Squash and stretch is the new one. The example downstairs is a great starting point for what a successful project is going to look like. If you look at the animation on the assignment sheet, you can see that there's some really great squash and stretch. It even stretches out before it hits the bounce, almost anticipating that it's about to strike the ground, which I think is really fun, okay? Just starts to suggest that this is a character moving under its own power versus just an inanimate sphere bouncing across the universe, right? So for this homework, it just needs to bounce 3 times. I don't care how, I don't care on what. Someone one semester made a little picture of Mario, and Mario is jumping on top of all the little Mario pipes in the game. Be creative, have fun with this. This is an art class, so have fun with it, right? This is a lot of fun, okay? When you're done with this homework assignment, please make sure that you're rendering out an animated GIF, and you need to submit both the animated GIF and your Adobe Animate project file to the Dropbox back here on Canvas, all right? So that's your homework. It's going to be at least 40 frames. So you're going to be doing at least 40, okay? At least 40. If you want to go more than this, I say rock and roll. Absolutely. I think that's awesome. That's a fantastic idea. Excuse me. All right. In addition, if you want to see some really great examples from your textbook, okay, on page 36 and 37 of the Animator Survival Kit, you get some wonderful visual reference as to how this is supposed to look if you need some extra love and some extra help, okay? The banner image on this assignment sheet does a really great job of illustrating the power of arcs and our spacing. So this is one possible solution. But add that squash and stretch in there. It's so much more impactful. It's due next week, and it's worth 50 points. Let's go back to the lab assignment. The lab assignment you're going to be able to do here in class, you probably can knock it out here in the next 30 minutes or so, okay, if you start getting to work. And it's just going to be a single jump. I want us to practice a little bit, creating these characters that will squash and stretch based on its environment. However, I still want you to show me the principle of arcs and timing. So with that said, if you're doing a simple single jump, how is your character going to be jumping? Yeah, it could be a ball. I think I'd keep it pretty simple for the lab exercise. Is your character going to be jumping? Oh, let's put it this way. Is your character going to land in the same spot that it takes off from? No. If you were to jump up in the air, would you be able to land in the exact same spot that you took off from? No. It's impossible to do that, right? So our characters should also kind of honor that idea. So even in something as a single jump, we should be participating with the principle of arcs. Don't forget about gravity with our principle of timing. And of course, this is a great opportunity to start to invent some really great squash and stretch poses. Okay, this one's going to be about 48 frames. Okay, so there's a great chance for you to really squash your character down, and then whoop, have your character jump up, kind of slow down at the top of the arc, and come back down again with another squash and stretch. Think of your character like springs. That's the best illustration I think I can provide. We compress the spring, it jumps up. When it comes back down, it compresses and then expands. Okay? Yeah, you draw a spring. That's a great place to start. This is an excellent, excellent example of the application of squash and stretch. Like every other assignment that we're going to have in this course, please make sure you're submitting both your Animate document and your animated GIF when you're done. Okay? We've got about 30 minutes left in class today. I want to give you this time to start working on your lab assignment. If you have any questions or if you run into any bugs, let's get those solved today. I certainly don't want you walking home this afternoon with a problem in your back pocket. All right? Let's get to work. Let me turn off the live stream and we'll get going.